So hey guys, so how do we raise rents? Practically, how do we raise rents? For the most part, we're going to be using an AST, an assured short hold tenancy agreement. Okay. Now within that, you have a couple of levels. Okay. So you got legislation. That's the law, if you like. Okay. The legislation, and the legislation will restrict certain things. Okay. Then a next step down, you've got contracts. Okay. You got a contract, which is the AST. All right. And so then the next step down or next step up or whatever you might talk about is you've got, common sense and that sort of thing. All right. So depending on how do you raise rents, obviously, let's start off with common sense. Common sense, you've got to have some common sense, because if you raise from 1,000 to 1,500 because you can, and you know that the tenant can't afford it, you're going to lose a tenant and you'll have all those extra additional costs, okay, to get a new tenant in. So is that worth it? All right. So there's some common sense element. Then there's a contract. Does the contract actually allow it? If the contract doesn't allow it, then are you able to raise the rents? Okay, so for the most part, you will have either a phrase in there, or you'll rely on legislation for things like you've got Section 13. So Section 13 basically says that you can raise the rent. Now, what can you raise the rent? If you raise the rent too much, the tenant can take you to the first tier tribunal, okay? And basically what that means is they can go to the tribunal, and the tribunal will rule whether this is unfair amount. And they'll look at the evidence you provide them, they'll look at the situation, all that sort of thing, and they'll make a determination, okay? So just be aware that the tenant can do that if you go too fast. And that's why I say small and often, all right, when you're raising things. But yes, you are able to raise rents, okay? Now, what I would say is Section 13, you can only do that once a year. So realistically, as good practice, once a year, you can do that, all right, with an AST. And in fact, the Section 13, you don't not need permission from the tenant to raise the rent by that, okay? As long as it's fair, then you can do that. Now, normally, what does fair mean? Fair means, well, a good way of giving evidence and justifying fair is to go with RPI or CPI or one of those measures. All right, if you stick to that sort of increase, then you're probably not going to have too much of a problem, okay? Now, obviously, in recent years, we've had 10, 12%, on the RPI and the CPI, that sort of thing. Obviously, that's coming down now, but, so we've been able to raise them a lot more. Normally, it might be 20, 30, 50 bucks, $100 that it increases, on a yearly basis, which is fine. That might be 3, 4, 5%, whatever. But that's sort of normally fair. If you stick to that, you shouldn't have too many problems. Obviously, you can aim for more than that, but then you might end up in a first tier tribunal thing, in which case you may end up having to pay costs. You may not get the increase. And what I would suggest is that if you're going to do a Section 13, you've got to make sure that you issue it properly. If you don't issue it properly, it could be deemed as void, okay? And therefore you've got to reissue it again, all right? So that's where using a professional agent who knows what they're talking about is a fantastic thing to do, all right? So yeah, so that's how you practically raise rents, all right, is through a Section 13. You would do that normally, or you could, the other way, reissue the contract altogether as a fresh new contract, all right? But normally, if they're in contract, it's a lot easier just to issue a Section 13 notice. And what I'd normally say is if you can negotiate that beforehand so that they agree with it, it just makes everything work so much better. But if they don't agree with it, it doesn't matter. As long as it's done legal, it's fair, all that sort of stuff, then they have to adhere to that, and you would be able to get them evicted if they do not allow the increase or pay the increase in rent. All right, guys, like, follow, and obviously comment. Happy to have a discussion. See you later. Bye.